In the shadows of 19th century England, a woman lived a life so scandalous that her own family tried to destroy the evidence of her existence. But what I'm about to tell you blends documented history with the darkest theories about Anne Lister's private life. Theories that, if true, reveal secrets that would have destroyed her completely if discovered during her lifetime. Anne Lister wasn't just any woman. She was a landowner, explorer, businesswoman who defied every rule society had written for her gender. But her greatest secret wasn't her masculine clothes or her refusal to marry men. It was the coded diary she kept, 6 million words written in a cipher so complex that scholars spent over a century cracking it. And when they finally did, they discovered something that shocked even modern historians. According to some controversial accounts, Anne Lister had married another woman. Not just once, but she had lived as a wife to women, conducting secret ceremonies and building relationships that society declared impossible. Her diaries reveal the raw truth of a woman who loved women in an era when such love could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. She called herself Fred in intimate moments, dressed as a man in public, and navigated Yorkshire's elite with a confidence that was both magnetic and dangerous. While other women of her class learned watercolors and piano, Anne studied Latin, Greek, and mathematics, while they waited for husbands. Disputed historical accounts suggest she was choosing her own lovers with calculated precision. Her diary entries document a woman so confident in her desires that even today's standards seem conservative by comparison. She wrote about every kiss, every touch, every whispered promise made in drawing rooms where ladies were supposed to discuss nothing more scandalous than the weather. Some historians argue that Anne's boldness came from desperation rather than confidence. Living in a world that offered women like her no legitimate path to happiness, she created her own rules with the precision of someone who understood that discovery meant destruction. She didn't just dress like a man or walk like a man. Controversial theories suggest she claimed privileges that society reserved exclusively for masculine sexuality. Her neighbors called her Gentleman Jack behind her back, thinking it was mockery, but they had no idea how accurate that nickname really was. According to the most shocking interpretations of her diaries, Anne didn't just court women. She seduced wives, broke engagements, and left emotional wreckage across Yorkshire's most respectable families, all while maintaining the perfect facade of an eccentric spinster who simply preferred books to marriage. But here's what makes her story truly devastating. Anne wasn't born into rebellion. Some biographers argue she was created by a society that gave her only two choices: disappear or become someone else entirely. She chose transformation, becoming what would later be recognized as one of history's first documented cases of someone living authentically outside traditional gender expectations. Yet the psychological cost of that authenticity would prove almost unbearable. The most haunting aspect of her story isn't just what she did, it's what she became in the process. Her diary entries reveal someone who started as a passionate young woman seeking love and evolved into something harder, more calculating, more willing to risk everything for moments of genuine connection. Whether that transformation was survival, corruption, or simply the inevitable result of loving dangerously in dangerous times remains a mystery that continues to fascinate historians today. If you think you know what it means to live authentically, you've never heard Anne Lister's story. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about love, identity, and survival in an unforgiving world. But her first love affair nearly broke her before she even understood who she was. And the woman who captured her heart, she was closer than anyone could have imagined. Anne Lister's diaries weren't just personal records. They were weapons of mass destruction, written in a code so intricate that it would take cryptographers decades to unlock their secrets. But what they revealed was worth the wait, because hidden within those 6 million words was the most explicit, most emotionally raw confession of queer love ever documented in the 19th century. She didn't write like other women of her time. While her contemporaries penned delicate observations about flowers and charity work, Anne documented her relationships with the clinical precision of a scientist and the passion of a poet. Every entry was written in her own invented cipher, a combination of Greek letters, zodiac signs, and mathematical symbols that transformed her most intimate thoughts into an unbreakable code. She called it her crypt hand, and it would become both her salvation and her prison. The diary entries reveal a woman wrestling with desires she couldn't name and couldn't escape. I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus beloved by them in turn. My heart revolts from any other love than theirs, she wrote in one of her most vulnerable moments. But vulnerability was a luxury Anne couldn't afford in a world where women like her were either locked away in asylums or driven to suicide by the weight of their own shame. What makes these diaries truly extraordinary isn't just their sexual frankness, it's their emotional honesty. According to some interpretations, Anne documented not just her physical relationships, but the psychological strategies required to maintain them in a hostile society. She wrote about the calculated risks of loving married women, about the thrill and terror of seducing daughters of Yorkshire's elite, about the constant fear that discovery would mean destruction for everyone involved. But the diaries also reveal Anne's internal struggle between desire and survival. Modern historians debate whether her actions were predatory manipulation or desperate attempts at connection in a world that offered no safe space for women like her. She wrote about nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if God had created her as some kind of cruel experiment, destined to want what she could never safely have. Yet even in her darkest moments, she refused to apologize for who she was. The most haunting entries show us a brilliant mind slowly fragmenting under the pressure of living multiple lives simultaneously. Anne had to be the perfect daughter, the respectable landowner, the eccentric spinster, and the passionate lover, all at once. Some scholars argue that the psychological strain of maintaining these personas created the very behaviors that would later be interpreted as manipulative or destructive. Her most devastating entry reads, "No one will ever know what it costs to love like this, to want with such hunger that it feels like dying. Every day, you cannot touch the one you crave." These words weren't written by a predator. They were written by someone trapped between authentic desire and social survival, trying to find a way to love that wouldn't destroy everything she touched. The codes weren't just about secrecy. They were about survival in the truest sense. Every encrypted word represented a moment when Anne chose to document her truth rather than erase it, even knowing that discovery could mean losing everything. The diaries reveal someone who understood that her love was revolutionary simply by existing, regardless of how she expressed it. But what the diaries don't reveal is often as telling as what they do. The gaps, the missing entries, the moments when even coded language felt too dangerous. These silences speak to the crushing weight of living authentically in a world designed to destroy people like her. Her most dangerous relationship was about to test every survival strategy she had developed, and the woman who would change everything. She was about to enter Anne's life at the exact moment when love and destruction would become impossible to distinguish. Her name was Eliza Raine, and she was the first woman to teach Anne Lister that love could be both salvation and damnation wrapped in the same kiss. They met at Manor School in York when Anne was just 17. Two girls thrown together in the suffocating world of female education, where young ladies were supposed to learn submission, not seduction. But Anne had never been interested in following rules, and Eliza was about to discover desires she never knew existed. The attraction was instant and devastating. Eliza was everything Anne wasn't supposed to want. Beautiful, delicate, feminine in all the ways that made Anne's heart race and her carefully constructed world tremble. Anne wrote in her diary that watching Eliza walk across the school courtyard was like seeing an angel who had fallen specifically to tempt me toward my own destruction. But temptation was a luxury Anne couldn't resist, especially when Eliza began looking back with equal fascination. Their first kiss happened in the school library during evening prayers, when everyone else was supposedly focused on salvation. Anne had cornered Eliza between the poetry shelves, close enough to smell the lavender water in her hair, close enough to see the fear and desire warring in her eyes. "I told her that I loved her," Anne wrote, "and she whispered, that she had been waiting for me to say it, though she didn't understand why. That kiss lasted 30 seconds and changed both their lives forever. What followed was 6 months of the most intense relationship of Anne's young life. They developed an elaborate system of signals. Touching certain books meant, "Meet me tonight." Wearing specific ribbons meant, "I need to see you." And leaving pressed flowers in designated places meant, "I love you more than my own safety." Anne documented every stolen moment with the precision of someone who knew that memory might be all she would have left. But Eliza was fragile in ways that Anne was only beginning to understand. According to Anne's later diary entries, the weight of their secret love began crushing Eliza almost immediately. She started having nightmares about being discovered, about being sent away in disgrace, about burning in hell for desires she couldn't control. Anne tried to be strong enough for both of them, but she was still learning how to navigate love in a world that called such feelings an abomination. Some historians argue that what happened to Eliza wasn't Anne's fault, but rather the inevitable result of two young women trying to love each other in a society designed to destroy that possibility. The psychological pressure of maintaining their relationship while pretending to be normal schoolgirls created cracks in Eliza's mental state that grew deeper with each passing day. The breaking point came when Eliza's parents announced her engagement to a local clergyman. Anne watched the woman she loved transform from a passionate lover into a hollow shell who spoke only of duty and respectability. Their final night together was spent in Anne's dormitory bed, where Eliza whispered apologies between tears, and Anne promised that she would find a way to save them both. 3 weeks later, Eliza suffered a complete mental breakdown. She was found in the school chapel at dawn, speaking to invisible angels and claiming that demons were trying to drag her to hell for loving another woman. Her family took her away that same day, and Anne never saw her again. But the trauma of watching love destroy someone she cherished would shape every relationship Anne had for the rest of her life. Eliza's destruction taught Anne the most brutal lesson of her young life, that love between women wasn't just forbidden. It was dangerous enough to shatter the very people she wanted to protect. Instead of breaking her spirit, Eliza's loss transformed Anne into someone more strategic and infinitely more determined to find a way to love that wouldn't end in tragedy. Because she had just realized that if she was going to love women, she would need to learn how to survive in a world designed to destroy them both. After Eliza's breakdown, Anne Lister made a calculated decision that would define the rest of her life. If society wanted to destroy women who loved other women, she would simply stop being a woman in the traditional sense. What emerged from her grief was something unprecedented. A person who existed in the space between genders, using masculinity as both shield and weapon in her war against a world that refused to let her love freely. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was surgical in its precision. Anne began studying men with the intensity of a scientist, cataloging their gestures, their speech patterns, their way of claiming space in rooms full of people who expected them to dominate. She practiced walking with confidence that bordered on aggression, lowered her voice until it carried masculine authority, and learned to shake hands with the firm grip that communicated power rather than submission. But the clothes were just the beginning of her disguise. Anne began wearing all black, stark, uncompromising black, that made her look like a walking shadow in a world of pastel femininity. The fitted coat, the tall boots, the way she carried herself like someone who had never been taught to make herself smaller. It all combined to create something that confused and intimidated everyone who met her. People didn't know whether to treat her as a woman or acknowledge her as something else entirely, and that confusion became her greatest protection. According to some controversial historians, the psychological toll of living between genders was both devastating and liberating. Anne wrote about feeling like she was performing masculinity while her authentic self watched from somewhere deep inside, noting every gesture that felt foreign. Yet she also wrote about the intoxicating rush of walking into rooms and commanding respect that had never been available to her as a conventional woman. "I am neither man nor woman," she confessed to her diary, but something more dangerous. Her masculine presentation wasn't just about gender expression. Disputed accounts suggest it was about survival strategy. Anne had realized that in order to court women effectively in her era, she needed to offer them something their potential male suitors couldn't: the combination of masculine confidence with feminine understanding. She could approach women with boldness, while intuitively knowing how to navigate their emotional landscapes in ways that only someone who shared their experiences could understand. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far, because what Anne did next challenged every social convention of her time. Her neighbors began calling her Gentleman Jack, thinking it was an insult. But Anne wore the nickname like armor. She had successfully created a persona so convincing that people forgot she wasn't actually a man, even when they knew intellectually that she was a woman. The cognitive dissonance she created in others became her protection. It was easier for society to dismiss her as an eccentric spinster than to confront what she actually represented. But living as Gentleman Jack came with costs that Anne hadn't anticipated. The more convincingly she performed masculinity, the more isolated she became from other women who might have understood her struggle. She existed in a space between worlds, too masculine for women's spaces, too female for men's acceptance, too unconventional for either group to fully embrace. The most heartbreaking aspect of her transformation was how it separated her from her own vulnerability. In order to protect herself and any woman who might love her, Anne had to become someone who appeared invulnerable. But that meant she could never fully reveal her own fears, her own desperate longing to be seen and accepted for who she really was beneath all the careful performances. And just when her masculine facade had become sophisticated enough to fool everyone, including herself sometimes, Anne was about to meet the woman who would see straight through every layer of protection she had built. Anne Walker wasn't supposed to be the woman who would change everything. She was quiet, wealthy, and considered one of Yorkshire's most eligible spinsters, exactly the kind of woman who lived her entire life without causing scandal or attracting unwanted attention. But when she met Anne Lister at a dinner party in 1832, something ignited between them that would lead to the most audacious act of Anne's entire life: a secret marriage that defied every law, every tradition, and every expectation of what was possible between two women. The courtship was unlike anything Anne had experienced before. Anne Walker saw through her masculine performance immediately, but instead of being repelled, she was fascinated. Where other women had been intimidated by Anne's intensity, Anne met her passion with equal fire. Where others had been confused by Anne's gender presentation, Anne understood instinctively that she was falling in love with someone who existed beyond conventional categories. Their first kiss happened in Anne's drawing room while her servants were at church, and Anne wrote that it felt like finally coming home to myself after years of wandering in exile. But Anne Walker came with complications that made their relationship exponentially more dangerous. She was an heiress with a fortune that made her one of the most watched women in Halifax. Her family had already arranged several potential marriages to prominent men, and her sudden disinterest in masculine suitors raised immediate suspicions. More concerning, Anne suffered from what society called nervous disorders, episodes that made her vulnerable to being declared mentally incompetent if anyone wanted to challenge her decisions. Some historians argue that Anne's courtship strategy was born of desperation rather than manipulation. She positioned herself as Anne's protector and emotional salvation, convincing her that marriage to a man would destroy her sensitive nature, while a life with Anne would allow her to flourish. Whether this was genuine care or calculated seduction remains one of the most debated aspects of their relationship. The proposal happened 6 months after they met, in the library of Shibden Hall. But it wasn't conventional. Anne asked Anne to participate in a private ceremony that would bind them together as wives in the eyes of God, even if the law could never recognize their union. She had researched Anglican marriage rites and discovered that the essential elements required no official witness beyond the couple themselves and their creator. It was legally meaningless and spiritually revolutionary. The ceremony took place on Easter Sunday, 1834, in the parish church of Shibden. Anne wore her best black suit, Anne wore white silk, and they spoke vows they had written themselves. According to Anne's diary, watching Anne promise to love, honor, and cherish her felt like witnessing magic that changed the fundamental nature of reality. They had claimed the right to be married, regardless of what society said was possible. But their secret marriage created immediate problems that neither woman had fully anticipated. Anne Walker's family began pressuring her to explain her continued refusal of male suitors, while Anne's neighbors noticed suspicious amounts of time spent together. The psychological pressure of maintaining their relationship while pretending to be merely friends was crushing both their spirits in ways that neither had expected. The most heartbreaking aspect of their secret marriage was how it amplified rather than resolved the fundamental impossibility of their situation. They had found a way to commit to each other completely, but they still couldn't actually build a life together in any way that society would recognize or accept. Their wedding had been an act of defiance, but defiance couldn't change the practical reality of what it meant to be two women trying to love each other in 1834. And just when they thought their secret was safe, someone who knew the truth about their relationship was about to use that knowledge in ways that would test every survival. Living as someone else's wife while pretending to be a spinster was slowly fragmenting both women from the inside out. Anne had expected the external challenges of maintaining their secret, but she hadn't anticipated how the constant performance would eat away at her sense of self. Every morning brought the same impossible choice: be the devoted wife who longed to hold Anne's hand in public, or perform as the eccentric bachelor who showed appropriate disinterest in romantic attachments. Anne Walker's mental state was deteriorating even faster. The woman who had seemed so strong during their courtship was crumbling under the weight of living a comprehensive lie. She began having panic attacks during social gatherings, terrified that someone would notice the way she looked at Anne, the way her voice changed when she spoke her name. "I feel like I am disappearing," she confessed to Anne during one of their secret meetings. "I don't know who I am when I'm not with you, but I can't be who I am when I am with you." The psychological torture was amplified by Yorkshire's suffocating social structure. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and the slightest deviation from expected behavior became endless speculation. Anne and Anne had to choreograph their interactions with theatrical precision, never standing too close, never talking too long, never allowing their faces to reveal the intimacy that existed between them in private. According to some interpretations of Anne's diary entries from this period, she was slowly losing her grip on coherent identity. She wrote about feeling like an actor who had forgotten her lines, where every gesture felt artificial and every word tasted like deception. The confident, strategic person she had been before meeting Anne was fragmenting into someone who second-guessed every decision and saw threats in every innocent conversation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of their psychological torment was how it poisoned their relationship with each other. The stress of constant performance was making them both paranoid and suspicious. Some historians argue that Anne began questioning whether Anne was emotionally strong enough to maintain their secret long-term, while Anne started wondering whether Anne's love was genuine or simply another form of control. Their isolation was perhaps that they couldn't confide in anyone, couldn't seek support from friends or family, couldn't even acknowledge to each other how much they were suffering without risking complete emotional collapse. They were drowning together while pretending to swim separately, and the psychological strain was pushing both of them toward breaking points that terrified them equally. Sleep became impossible for both women. Anne wrote about lying awake calculating risks, imagining worst-case scenarios where they were discovered and destroyed. Anne's insomnia was worse. She would wake up screaming from nightmares where she was being dragged away to an asylum while Anne stood watching, unable or unwilling to save her. The chronic exhaustion made them both more fragile and prone to the kinds of mistakes that could expose everything. Anne began experiencing something she had never felt before: genuine terror. Not the calculated risk assessment that had always guided her previous relationships, but paralyzing fear that her very existence was toxic to the woman she loved. She started having violent fantasies about people who might expose them, imagining herself taking desperate action to protect Anne, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. The psychological pressure was also manifesting in physical symptoms that made their secret even harder to maintain. Anne was losing weight rapidly and developing nervous tics that made her behavior seem erratic to observers. Anne was drinking more heavily, using alcohol to numb the constant anxiety that made her feel like her skin was crawling with invisible threats. But just when their psychological torment seemed unbearable, an opportunity arose that would either provide the escape they desperately needed or push them both over the edge into complete destruction. The opportunity came in the form of Mariana Lawton, a married woman whose husband's frequent business trips left her isolated in a grand estate just outside Halifax. According to some controversial accounts, Mariana was everything that Anne Walker wasn't: confident, worldly, and dangerously willing to risk everything for the thrill of forbidden love. When she approached Anne at a charity event with barely concealed interest, Anne knew she was being offered something that could either liberate her from her psychological prison or destroy everything she had built. Disputed historical records suggest that Mariana had heard the whispers about Gentleman Jack and was intrigued rather than repelled by the rumors. She made it clear from their first conversation that she understood exactly what Anne was offering and was prepared to accept the consequences. "I have been married to a man for 12 years, she allegedly told Anne, "and I have never felt what I feel when I look at you." What followed was an affair that began with the intensity of wildfire and the secrecy of a military operation. Some historians argue that Anne found herself living 3 separate lives simultaneously: the eccentric spinster for public consumption, the devoted wife to Anne Walker, and now the passionate lover to a woman who demanded complete emotional surrender. The psychological strain was pushing Anne toward what her own diary describes as the edge of mental collapse. But Mariana was unlike any woman Anne had ever known. Where Anne Walker needed gentle reassurance, Mariana challenged Anne to be more authentic, more vulnerable, more willing to risk everything for genuine connection. According to Anne's encrypted diary entries, their encounters were charged with the electricity of 2 people who knew they were dancing on the edge of mutual destruction. The affair exposed a fundamental contradiction in Anne's nature that she had never been forced to confront. Anne Walker represented the possibility of safe, hidden love, careful, protective, sustainable. Mariana represented the possibility of authentic, dangerous love, passionate, honest, potentially catastrophic. Anne discovered that she was psychologically incapable of choosing safety when authenticity was offered, even knowing the cost. But Anne had underestimated how the affair would affect her relationship with Anne. The emotional energy required to maintain her connection with Mariana was draining her capacity for the careful, gentle nurturing that Anne needed to survive their secret life. Anne began noticing changes in Anne's behavior. The distraction, the emotional distance, the way Anne seemed to be performing their intimacy rather than feeling it. The most dangerous aspect of the affair wasn't the risk of exposure. It was the way Mariana began demanding more than Anne could safely give. Some accounts suggest she wanted Anne to abandon the pretense of respectability entirely, to run away together and build a life where they could love openly, regardless of the consequences. "You are destroying yourself trying to love safely," Mariana allegedly argued. Anne found herself caught between 2 women who represented completely different approaches to survival in a hostile world. Anne Walker wanted security and careful construction of a life that would allow them to love without destruction. Mariana wanted passion and complete abandonment of any pretense that their love could coexist with social acceptance. The breaking point came when Mariana issued an ultimatum that would force Anne to choose between the woman who offered her safety and the woman who offered her truth. The decision she made would reveal something about Anne Lister that even she hadn't fully understood about herself. Anne chose Mariana, not because she loved her more than Anne Walker, but because Mariana's ultimatum had exposed a truth that Anne could no longer deny. She was fundamentally incapable of choosing safety over authenticity. The careful, protective relationship she had built with Anne felt like suffocation compared to the raw honesty that Mariana demanded. So she made the choice that would reveal to everyone who knew her exactly how dangerous loving Anne Lister could be. The aftermath was swift and devastating. According to disputed accounts, Anne Walker's breakdown was complete and public. She was found by her servants, incoherent, and speaking about betrayal and abandonment. Her family immediately had her declared mentally incompetent and confined to a private asylum, claiming that her association with Anne Lister had driven her to madness. Anne watched from across the street as Anne was carried away, knowing that her choice had destroyed the one person who had loved her unconditionally. But Yorkshire society had been watching Anne's triangle with fascination and horror, and Anne's public breakdown gave them the permission they had been waiting for, to turn against the woman who had been scandalizing them for years. The whispers became accusations. The rumors became certainties. Suddenly, everyone who had ever felt uncomfortable around Anne Lister had a socially acceptable reason to express their disgust. The rejection began subtly, but escalated quickly. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended when Anne entered rooms. Shopkeepers became reluctant to serve someone whose money had always been welcome before. Anne discovered that she had become a pariah in her own community, someone whose presence was tolerated only because her family name still carried enough weight to prevent outright ostracism. Even Mariana, the woman for whom Anne had sacrificed everything, began distancing herself as the social consequences became clear. Some historians suggest that the passionate rebel, who had demanded authenticity, was apparently less comfortable with the reality of being publicly associated with Yorkshire's most notorious deviant. Their meetings became less frequent, their conversations more strained, and Anne realized that she had destroyed 2 relationships for someone who was ultimately too conventional to stand by her when the cost became real. The psychological isolation was crushing in ways that Anne hadn't anticipated. She had always been self-sufficient, confident in her ability to exist independently of others' approval. But the complete social rejection revealed how much she had depended on the grudging acceptance of her community to maintain her sense of self. Without it, she began questioning everything about her identity, her choices, and her fundamental worth as a human being. Her diary entries from this period reveal someone spiraling into despair. "I have become what they always said I was," she wrote. "Perhaps they were right to fear me. Perhaps I am exactly the kind of person who deserves to die alone and despised." The confident, strategic woman who had once orchestrated elaborate survival strategies was fragmenting into someone who could barely function in public spaces. The servants at Shibden Hall began treating her differently, whispering among themselves about the madness that seemed to follow their mistress wherever she went. Even her own family distanced themselves, making excuses to avoid visits and responding to her letters with increasingly cold formality. Anne found herself living in a house full of people who were paid to serve her, but could barely disguise their contempt. The final betrayal came when Anne's own body began rebelling against the psychological stress. She developed tremors that made writing difficult, insomnia that left her wandering the halls at all hours, and episodes of disorientation where she forgot where she was or what she was supposed to be doing. The physical manifestation of her psychological collapse made her isolation even more complete. But just when Anne thought she had lost everything worth losing, she received news that would either offer her a chance at redemption or push her toward a final act of desperation that would define her legacy forever. The news came in a letter marked with black wax. Anne Walker had died in the asylum, alone and forgotten, calling Anne's name until her final breath. According to disputed historical accounts, the woman Anne had promised to protect had withered away in confinement, her mind shattered by the betrayal of the one person she had trusted completely. But the letter contained something else that would change everything. Anne had left her entire fortune to Anne in a will written before her breakdown, along with a note that read simply, "For the love that might have been if we had been braver." The inheritance should have been Anne's salvation, but instead it became her curse. Everyone in Yorkshire now knew that she had profited from the destruction of an innocent woman, that her choices had led to tragedy, even beyond death. The money that could have bought her freedom felt like blood payment for sins she could never atone for. Anne found herself wealthy beyond imagination, and more isolated than ever, carrying guilt that was eating her alive from the inside. But the inheritance also revealed something unexpected. Anne Walker had been documenting their relationship in her own diary, written in plain English and hidden beneath floorboards in her bedroom. When her family discovered it after her death, they realized that Anne Lister's influence had been even more extensive than anyone had imagined. The diary revealed not just their secret marriage, but the entire emotional landscape of their relationship. It was evidence that could destroy not just Anne's reputation, but potentially land her in prison. Faced with exposure that would complete her destruction, Anne made the most desperate decision of her life. She would leave England forever and disappear into a world where no one knew her history, where she could start over without the weight of everyone she had failed to protect. But she wouldn't go alone. She would find one last woman to love, one final chance to prove that she was capable of something other than causing pain. Her target was Isabella Norcliffe, a childhood friend who had always harbored romantic feelings for Anne, but had been too timid to act on them. Some historians suggest that Isabella was everything that Anne's previous lovers weren't: stable, financially independent, and emotionally strong enough to survive the psychological demands of loving someone like Anne Lister. Anne's final seduction was unlike anything she had attempted before. Instead of manipulation and psychological games, controversial accounts suggest she offered Isabella complete honesty about her past, her failures, and her desperate need for redemption. She confessed everything: the affairs, the betrayals, the madness she had witnessed in other women, the guilt that was slowly killing her. "I am offering you the truth about who I am," she allegedly told Isabella. "I have been a monster, but I want to learn how to be human again." The decision Isabella made was both surprising and inevitable. She agreed to leave England with Anne, but on one condition: they would live as equals, not as manipulator and victim. There would be no psychological games, no elaborate seductions, no carefully constructed personas. If Anne wanted love, she would have to learn how to be vulnerable, how to need someone else, how to exist without the armor of control. Their departure from Yorkshire was as quiet as their love had once been dramatic. Two women boarding a ship to France, carrying nothing but each other, and the hope that geography might be enough to outrun the ghosts of Anne's past. It was either the beginning of Anne Lister's redemption or the final chapter in her long history of destruction. But what happened in France would prove whether some people are capable of genuine change or whether certain patterns are simply too deeply embedded to ever escape. France was supposed to be Anne Lister's redemption, but according to some controversial historical interpretations, redemption requires a capacity for change that some souls simply don't possess. Within 6 months of arriving in Paris, disputed accounts suggest that Anne had returned to her old patterns: the psychological manipulation, the elaborate seductions, the careful construction of lies designed to make her seem like salvation rather than destruction. Isabella Norcliffe, the woman who had believed in Anne's capacity for transformation, allegedly found herself trapped in the same cycle of emotional turmoil that had destroyed Anne Walker. The final betrayal came when Isabella discovered that Anne had been conducting affairs with French women while promising her complete devotion. But this time, Anne's victims fought back. The women she had seduced and abandoned in Paris were not isolated English spinsters. They were connected, sophisticated, and angry enough to expose her publicly. Anne Lister's reputation as a dangerous lover spread through Parisian society faster than she could contain it. Isabella's departure was swift and final. She left Anne a letter that allegedly read, "You convinced me that you were capable of love, but you are only capable of hunger." The woman who had been Anne's last hope for redemption walked away without looking back, leaving Anne alone in a foreign country with nothing but her wealth and her increasingly desperate need for validation. The isolation in France was different from the rejection she had experienced in Yorkshire. In England, she had been a notorious figure, someone whose presence generated whispers and speculation. In Paris, she was simply irrelevant, a strange Englishwoman whose eccentricities were neither shocking nor interesting to a society that had seen everything. The end came suddenly and almost anticlimactically. Anne died in Georgia in 1840 while traveling, officially from fever, but those who knew her suspected that she had finally exhausted her capacity for living with the weight of her own choices. She was found with her final diary entry incomplete, trailing off mid-sentence, as if she had simply lost the will to continue documenting a life that had become unbearable. But death couldn't erase what Anne Lister had accomplished, even accidentally. Her coded diaries, discovered decades later, provided the most complete record of lesbian life in the 19th century ever found. The woman who had lived as both pioneer and cautionary tale had also created space for ways of being that wouldn't be socially acceptable for another century. Her masculine presentation, her refusal to accept heterosexual marriage, her insistence on claiming sexual agency traditionally reserved for men, all of it challenged social structures in ways that would eventually benefit women she would never meet. The tragedy of Anne Lister isn't just that she may have destroyed the people she claimed to love. It's that she could have been extraordinary if she had learned to love without needing to control. She had the intelligence, the courage, and the revolutionary instincts to change the world. But according to some interpretations, she used those gifts to break individual hearts instead of breaking social barriers. Today, Anne Lister is remembered as both pioneer and warning. Her diaries revealed possibilities that inspired generations of women who loved women. But her methods remind us that survival and liberation are not the same thing. She found a way to exist authentically in a hostile world, but whether she ever found a way to love authentically remains one of history's most debated questions. Her legacy lives in every woman who has ever had to choose between safety and truth, between survival and authenticity. Anne Lister proved that it was possible to live as a lesbian in the 19th century, but she also proved that revolution without compassion can become just another form of violence. If her story has moved you, if you see yourself in her struggle between desire and destruction, subscribe now for more hidden histories of people who dared to love dangerously in times when love itself was dangerous.